Welcome to today's talk. My name is Bill Hewitt, and the subject matter is up on the board. You might ask yourself, what is a waypoint? If you're going from point A to point B, you can go along any route you want to. Any road will take you from point A to point B. If you have a waypoint, though, you got to go through that spot. You got to do that if you're going to get to B. And the Civil War is one of those spots for us. And so what I'm going to do over the course of an hour is talk to you about that waypoint. Maybe an hour and a half, I don't know. Steelers ain't playing, why worry? Here's the agenda for today. Now this talk is being photographed again and be put up on YouTube. And I want to tell you, if you haven't already done it, we've gotten some help from our friends. And this site on YouTube has all of our talks on it. And Matt's been videotaping them for whether or not it's a campfire, just a regular talk, a battle walk, these talks, they're all there. If you're a teacher and you got to teach the Civil War, put it on, take a nap, wake up in an hour. These things are a wealth of knowledge, and I would just encourage you to use it as frequently as you can. And again, thanks to our friends for helping us do this. Over the course of the talk today, we're going to cover some macro stuff and some micro stuff. We're going to go from one to the other. So at points you're going to say, I'm lost. I'm not following, I'm not tracking, I don't understand. Stay with it, because at the end we're just going to put it all back together and package it for you, okay? I'm going to bring some things up and let them hang. Toward the end I'm going to say, oh, remember that? We talked about that, and here it is now. Okay? So just stay with it. Now over the last few years, if you've been on some of my talks, whether or not it's Sacred Trust or Midwinter Conference or the park seminars, I have been showing you parts of an elephant at times. And so today we're going to kind of look at the whole elephant, if you will, okay, in that regard. Down at the bottom, I have tried at times, we might have been talking, like last year we talked about railroads and how important they were. But I had an ulterior motive. And I was trying to show you the difference between a historian and a military historian. You can know an awful lot about the Civil War. You can know everything about the Civil War. But if you don't know what came before it and you don't know what came after it, how do you know what relevance the Civil War has? How do you judge those people? How do you evaluate them? And so that's what a military historian does. And so we're going to kind of get into that a little bit more than what we have in the past as well. Okay, everybody with me? Now I know that irritates you. 623,000, 750,000 men dead, millions wounded. Get over it. We're going to analyze things. I know you have emotional ties to some people and some events here and in the Civil War in general. Get over it for the next hour and 30 minutes. If you're going to do analysis, it has to be unemotional. You cannot be tied to it. You can't see the relevance of it because your emotion will not let you see the relevance of it. The worst thing you can have is winning a war. We'll talk about that. Why? No reason to change. I just won. But consequently, sometimes the best thing you can have is losing a war, because then it causes introspection, because you don't want it to happen again. If you want to honor the men, the 623,000 men and women that died, let them be the last to have to pay for that mistake. Honor them by making sure no other person dies because of that mistake. You understand my point? That's why it's got to be unemotional. And remember, the other guy's learning. He's the guy that just lost. He's going to go, I'm going to get you next time. So if you're going to do analysis, you got to make your army better than what it was. Because that other guy is out there and he's trying to learn too. And you got to whip him next time as well. Okay, you're everybody with me? Okay, we're going to talk about capabilities of an army. And there's essentially 4 categories of capabilities: doctrine, leaders, equipment, and units. We're going to cover a little bit of each one of these in general. And I'll tell you what relevance that has. Okay? Doctrine is more than just tactics. It's procedures, it's habits that an army does. Let's say you do an attack. Every time you're doing an attack, in preparation for the attack, you put an artillery barrage in on the enemy. Well, now what's he doing? He's sitting there waiting in his little cubby hole until the barrage is over. Then he comes out. It's a habit. It's part of your doctrine. Okay? We'll talk about mobilization. You would have thought that the Civil War, we would have learned a lot about mobilization. We didn't learn nothing. We'll talk about that too. Okay. Under leaders, we talk about command and control. We talk about communications. There's not just processes, but it's also clarity of communication. Getting your subordinates to understand you. It's also interface with your government. How many times in the Civil War do you always have to hear about this general didn't get along with that general? That general was in Washington causing trouble. Interface with the president, interface with the Secretary of War. It goes on and on and on. All those personality things. That's part of the leadership thing. Okay? Leaders, you have 2 things. You have leadership and you got management. We have some fellas in the Civil War that were great managers, lousy leaders. You know the difference, right? Leaders is all about getting somebody to do something that he really doesn't want to do and get him to do it willingly. That's a good leader. There are not many of them. We'll talk about a couple of them as we go through the process. Equipment. I was reading about a shop in, I think it was Illinois. It made union uniforms. There were 800 women working in that shop making union uniforms. You don't think of that. You look at an artillery piece, a carriage and a limber. How many pieces? Hundreds of pieces. Little wedgies, pins, nails. All of that stuff's equipment. Okay? So not only is it the strength of your army, it's the strength of what's backing it up. The depots and the arsenals. Everybody with me? Okay. When you talk about units, everybody always talks about the infantry and artillery and cavalry. But how about the industrial base? Who's going to train those people? How about filling out forms, clerks, farriers? I was getting ready for today's talk. I'm sitting there going, holy smoke. City Point, you know, down at the end of the war, down there in Southern Virginia, City Point. How many blacksmiths did it have? Anybody know? 1,800. It's amazing. So units are all of those kinds of people. And it goes on and on and on. Down at the bottom, the character of your soldiers. Each army is different. Each army has its own characteristics, strengths and weaknesses. And you have to understand that as well if you're going to talk about an army capabilities. How adaptable are they? How determined are they? How perseverant are they? Some armies, well, we won't list them there by name, but you know, they fire a couple rounds and surrender. That's fine. Always glad to have those guys around. When you line up these four things, it talks about a combined capability. You have to have all four of them to give you a certain capability and potential. You may not live up to your potential. But that's the end state, that's the extreme that you can do when you line those things up. It tells you what's possible, not what you're going to get, but what's possible. So consequently, usually you end up with something like this. There's an imbalance. You may have equipment that is much more sophisticated than your needs, that your leaders don't understand yet, that they haven't fully assimilated yet. We're going to talk about that today too. And so you got to kind of move, fix the weak links, figure out how to do it. You bear with me so far? You have the past, you have the current, and where you're trying to go. If you're trying to devise a new piece of equipment, a new artillery cannon, we'll talk about that today. What does it have to do and why? How many am I going to make? What's it going to do? What's it going to give me? Okay? I call it a journey over time. Journey is an interesting word. You can use the word progress. He turned and said, I have watched the progress of the Army of the Potomac ever since it was organized and have been greatly interested in reading the accounts of the splendid fighting it has done. And so this is a Civil War general commenting on the Army of the Potomac and talking about how it has progressed, how its capabilities have improved over time. Okay? We talked about this a little while ago. You got to be careful when you analyze stuff, because people are going to start to think you're crazy if you draw conclusions that are too far out there, that cannot be understood. That's one of the downsides of doing analysis. Can you imagine, after 4 years of fighting, and at the end of the war, you have the Battle of Five Forks, and now the Union Army is starting to push through the hole. And after a day or two, Grant links up with Meade. Meade's not feeling well, he's in a wagon, but he's staying up and he's giving orders, but he's just kind of immobile. And Grant talks about pushing Lee. And Grant's response is, I don't want to push him, I want to get ahead of him. We'll come back to that in a little while as well. But now you understand the difference in leadership and expectation. I don't want to push him. I've been pushing him for 4 years. I want to get ahead of him. And so Grant will say that, and Meade will issue the instructions. And then here we go. Katie, bar the door. You know? Now these capabilities of an army, you surely would like them to all go in unison. That would make it a great plan, wouldn't it? It never works that way. After all, you're dealing with the Army. You know what I mean? The grand plan. Nope. Usually you get something like that. We're going to talk about the cartridge today. Rifle bullet. Okay? And then that one little change has got to drag the other ones forward. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. but it's got to drag the other ones forward to make improvements, to make sure that line stays constant. Leaders, units, equipment, and doctrine all stay in line, more or less. Now the other guy, remember I told you he's studying too. And so if you get out there and you got something that's really good and really going to change the battlefield, he's going to attack it. That's his job. Minimize your strength, attack your weakness. Okay? I used to tell my students, everything I teach you is for the first battle. That's my job, get you past the first battle. That's it. After that, you're on your own. The man that evolves the quickest will win, almost always, if you kept politicians out of it, you know. Oh, there was a Middle Eastern prophet some time ago. You might have read about him that talks about a prophet in his own town. There's a lot of resistance to change in the military. Here's listed some things. It's good enough. We won. That is a great trap. The top 3 bullets are essentially learning no lessons from an event. Punish advocates for change. If you're a historian, you may recall that one of the great early proponents for air power was who? Billy Mitchell. What'd they do to him? Court-martial him. Don't be doing that stuff. We'll fix you. Right? So there'll be some resistance to change. And you got learning the wrong lessons. Quote, some of our generals failed because they worked out everything by rule. They knew what Frederick did at one place, they knew what Napoleon did at another. They were always thinking about what Napoleon would do. Unfortunately for their plans, the Rebs were thinking about something else. I don't underrate the value of military knowledge, but if men make war in slavish observation to rules, they will fail. No rules will apply the condition of war as different as those which exist in Europe or America. Consequently, when our generals are working out problems of an ideal character, problems that would have looked well on the blackboard, practical facts are often neglected. To that extent, I consider remembrances of old campaigns a disadvantage. Okay? So sometimes learning the wrong lesson or learning the half lesson will occur. And so we'll talk about a couple of the half lessons learned in the Civil War and some of the wrong lessons. We're going to talk a little bit about the history and how the Civil War was evaluated. You know, we had a lot of foreign observers here from lots of countries, and they went back and told their bosses whatever they're going to tell them. But those bosses were generals, and they didn't like change sometimes. And sometimes those observers they were looking at a minute thing. For example, the British spent a lot of effort on cavalry. They realized that the sword, saber, was overcome by the rifle. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's what they got out of the Civil War. They learned a little bit about maneuver, but not much. The Civil War was viewed primarily by the Europeans as an anomaly. It wasn't going to happen here. No use studying it. World War I is going to change their viewpoint over in Europe. They're going to realize World War I was not the first war. It was the U.S. Civil War. And we should have paid attention, but we didn't. And as for us being the Yankees, we won. Why should we change? We're in America. We're going to develop coastal artillery. See how that worked out for us, right? That's it. That's what we got out of the Civil War. And a couple other things we'll talk about. Some of the Europeans were paying attention. JFC Fuller, Major General, British Army, is going to start paying attention in the 1920s. And also a theoretician named Liddell Hart about the indirect approach, frontal attacks. After the World War I, they're going to kind of realize the same thing we should have realized in the Civil War. Don't do frontal attacks, not anymore. They're done. And so they're going to advocate maneuver in Europe. But you see, they're advocating for change. So is anybody going to pay attention? Not much. We did have some forward thinkers. We'll come back to that in a little while. Here were Fuller's observations. Now, Liddell Hart is going to talk about, in the 1920s again, the indirect approach. He's going to talk about Grant at Vicksburg. You know, at Vicksburg, now Grant is going to cross the Mississippi River below Vicksburg and then continue on, go toward the east, run a couple battles, then come back on Vicksburg. To do that, he's going to break his supply lines. So this is 1863. The most vocal opponent to breaking his supply lines was who? Sherman. Don't do it. Why? The rules say don't do it. Remember my quote about rules. So Grant's going to do it in 63, and who does it in 64? Sherman. Sherman was learning from Grant. Don't be so attached to the rules that you become ineffective. Interesting, huh? We showed you this slide last year. The indirect approach is simply not attacking frontally. Here's Sherman's advance against Johnston. Johnston's set up here. What's Sherman do? Goes around, Johnston has to pull back. They have a little battle. Sherman stocks up, moves to the flank, has to pull back, Johnston has to pull back, and so it goes. So again, not attacking strength. And Liddell Hart would say this campaign under Sherman was the greatest example of indirect approach. And he used the Civil War, our Civil War, and that campaign as an example. Okay? Now we have a half lesson learned. Why? Sherman was the indirect approach to Lee. After Sherman got to Atlanta, Grant suggested he go to Mobile, shown here by the red line. Sherman goes, no, we're going to go the other way. We're going to put General Lee in a box. And so sometimes even great theoreticians only learn the half lesson. Everybody with me? Who's lost? Don't be embarrassed. I was lost last night when I was reviewing this. Don't be embarrassed. So we have a lot of work in England in the 1920s, but no one was paying attention. A couple guys were. You see, the other guy, he's not emotionally tied to your problems or to your set of circumstances or constraints. And so when Liddell Hart was asked to edit some of the Rommel papers, he came in contact with a lot of generals that Rommel worked with and the family and things like that. So he had to ask him, did Rommel ever talk about my work? Oh yeah, all the time. And Guderian also made comments. See, they don't have anything to overcome in their own country. And so they were paying attention. Isn't it interesting how things work out? They had no vested interest that they had to overcome with their local authorities. Okay, the American response to the Civil War. Time and time and time again, what did the generals say? That West Point training is great. Well, given that there were thousands of leaders, and for every Chamberlain you had dozens and dozens of Colegroves, Chamberlain being the defender on Little Round Top, did pretty good. Colegrove was the other guy on the other end of the line, did pretty bad. So everybody said, gee, that West Point training was good, but nobody cared about the thousands of regimental commanders and brigade commanders that had no training at all in the Civil War. And how many men paid for that? Did we change? No. Why? I went to West Point. Why should I change? I'm Hancock, Grant, whatever. You're right with me. And we also talked about coastal artillery was our only response. Later, in studying the Civil War, J. Louvas, you all know his works. J. Louvas did some works on Five Forks with Sheridan, but he limited it again to what Sheridan did at Five Forks. Move your cavalry to a flank, have rifles instead of swords, put firepower down, and that sort of thing. He missed, Mr. Louvas, missed the bigger lesson of Five Forks. How many chances did Lee have at doing a pursuit? 7 days campaign, Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, and you might want to say Fredericksburg too, but I don't, I'll gut you on that one. How many chances did General Meade have on pursuits? 1 after Gettysburg, which everybody finds fault for because he didn't do it. Okay? Over 110 miles in 7 days. And you remember my discussion earlier. I don't want to push him. I want to get ahead of him. Grant knew exactly what to do and how to do it. And he did it with the likes of those people that had been slugging it out for 4 years. Not only is this a great example of indirect approach, but also deep attack. Disrupting the chain of the command and control of an enemy by going so deep that he has to fall back. He is in disarray. He's not in command of his forces. This is what the deep attack process is. Well, good for Grant. Some Americans were paying attention. You all know that General Eisenhower and General Patton were early proponents of tank warfare, and they were ostracized for it, just like I mentioned earlier. Not going to do that stuff. We're infantry. Them tanks are bad. Anybody remember the Louisiana maneuvers? General Patton understood about the indirect approach. He just went into another state. They said, here's your area of where you're supposed to conduct an attack. I'll just go in this way. Went into another state to attack the enemy in the flank. After World War II, the last MacArthur, did you ever consider indirect approach? He said, I called it island hopping. Yes, I've heard. You remember, we're not going to take every island in the Pacific. We're going to take one island, we're going to hop, take some more. Indirect approach. Okay, so now we're going to cover the Civil War, which is why you all came here, I hope. We're going to talk about some obvious ones and some ones missed. We're going to focus on the cartridge, the rifle cartridge, the cannon, and the change of warfare itself in the Civil War. Here are some of the obvious ones. We talked about railroads last year, and Matt's got the the video, so just you can toggle that. I ain't going to talk about that whole program. But railroads were important. By 1864, after 3 years of hard work, your supplies had to come from someplace else. And so with the size of the armies, here's the railroad. With the size of the armies, how are you going to supply them? Railroads. Here's what they're going to build at City Point to supply the Army. The requirements are for a little bit over 800 tons a day, but they're going to be able to have the capability and push 1,400 tons a day using the railroads there. By World War I, the zone for the American Army was selected for solely one reason and one reason only. And if you read General Pershing's report, he will tell you it's for railroads. Why? Because he needs a lot of stuff. When you look at World War I, you're going to say, okay, the Brits were up here, the French, and the Americans were down here, right? The Brits, they're going to use the ports closest to France and the railroads up there. The French likewise through Paris. And so the only railroads that were available were not being used by anybody, and so that's where Pershing goes, I want my sector down here. Because he knew he needed the railroads. Railroads were the key by then, okay? As just they were in 1864 and 5. We had some other improvements in the Civil War. You all know Jonathan Letterman, some of the innovations he had, medical records, echelon duties. William Keene is a neurosurgeon, serves in the military during the Civil War. After the war, he comes up with antiseptic surgical techniques, first use of clinical x-rays, operates on the President of the United States, treats a young teenage boy with polio from New York. Anybody ring a bell? So these 23,000 surgeons that were trained up in the Civil War are now mostly going to have their impact on the civilian life in America. But there'll be some leftovers between these two. And you see Dr. Keene there is in the uniform of a World War I. At the age of 80, he volunteers to go over and be a doctor for our boys in Europe. So you can well imagine the dedication that he had. I'm 20 years younger and I have a hard time getting up in the morning. When you consider prior to the Civil War, I think I'm out, okay. When you consider prior to the Civil War, in America we had less than 200 surgeries. And after the Civil War, by 1870, in one hospital alone in Massachusetts, we did 2,500 surgeries in 1 year. So who was doing those surgeries? Civil War doctors. So you want to talk about impact of the Civil War. Some other things. Oops, we're going to go back. Here's the UN Naval Hospital ship, Red Rover, up and down the Mississippi. There'll be other ones that work the coast. Here's a picture of a inside of them. This is during the Civil War. Surgical room, nurses, elevators, kitchens, all on board the ship. Jonathan Letterman. Okay. And here's the Legacy, one of the couple of ships we have that do these kinds of things. 1,000 beds, 12 operating rooms, dental support, optometry, pharmacy, 2 labs, freshwater condensers to make almost 1 million gallons of fresh water a day on board that ship. Legacy, Civil War. Telegraph. By 1864, now Grant can notify all his commanders to move all at once on or about 3 May. And everybody's going to be moving on 3 or 4 May. If anybody has a problem along the way, they're going to send telegrams back to Grant, and Grant's going to answer them. And so now he has control of all armies. And he can direct them all. And he can change the plan. I want you to go to Mobile. Really want to go to Savannah. Okay, go to Savannah. All done with telegram. I'm going to leave you hanging with this for a while. We'll come back to it. They tried to use balloons early on in the war. The French had tried it prior to the Civil War and done a little bit of work on it, but now we're going to use it for observation on the enemy and gathering intelligence. But by 1863, it's too much trouble. Doesn't work. Okay, fine. Not used again. But it's an example of now using what? Elevation to gather information on the enemy. Right? Now think about this a minute. In the Civil War, and before, for a long time, thousands of years, we lined up linearly, one dimension. Now all of a sudden we're going to use elevation as well. And if you recall my discussion on Five Forks, we talked about depth. So now we have length and depth and height of a battlefield. Where'd it come from? Civil War. We'll come back to balloons. Very interesting. You know, the metal ships, we started out, France was the first one to get a metal ship in 1856. Monitor and the Merrimack used the metal ships for war. Down the bottom is the Hunley. I didn't know this. They had torpedoes before the Civil War. But you had to kind of place them and then back up. Well, after the Civil War, a couple years later, now they had torpedoes that would go 300 or 400 yards. Self-mobile kind of stuff. But you think about this now. Since the dawn of recorded history, what have we used? Wooden ships for military purposes. All of a sudden, now what? We got metal ships. So what are we going to do with that? Somewhere around 700 BC, we have the first description of ships used for military purposes. We know there were some before, but we don't have any pictures of them. Might have been raft, I don't know. But now we went from there on wooden ships all the way to there, and within 25 years, Now we're building that thing. Where did it start? The Civil War. Massive ships. Dreadnoughts, they called them. Battleships. Okay, little micro stuff. I'm going to put a bunch of pieces together real quick. How am I doing with time? Real good. What happened prior to or before the Civil War? Doom, doom, come on. Shoot a round ball through a smoothbore musket. Maximum range about 100 yards, right? How long does it take to load that thing? 20 to 30 seconds. 20 seconds, good. Can you run 100 yards in 20 seconds? When I was younger, I could. My point is, you close up the lines, you shoot at each other a couple times, then what do? You put the bayonet on the rifle and you charge in between volleys. And it was that simple. And some of the biggest proponents for bayonet charges were who? These two. When we get into the Civil War, we're not shooting them round balls anymore, are we? With a cartridge, we can now shoot 300 yards. And by the time we add smokeless powder to it, we can shoot 800 yards accurately. We can put these bullets in a Gatling gun. Did you ever wonder if the Yankees had had one Gatling gun at Pickett's charge? I sometimes wonder that. And if I had 5, that would have been something. So we're going to put these cartridges now in belts. And the first machine gun will be developed in the early 1800s, 1880s. I'm sorry, 1880s. I always spend a lot of time if I'm in the Civil War as a commander. I'm going to set up behind a river or a stream or have a marsh in front of me. Why do I want to do that? You're going to stay here until I get done. So if you're not going to participate, I'm just going to... Why do you set up and like to have a marsh in front of you? It slows down the enemy. And you may get lucky. He's got to deal with the marsh or the stream or a river. Maybe his stuff will get wet. Maybe I'll get really lucky. But every 30 seconds he's struggling with that obstacle, I get another volley on him. That's what the value of that barrier is. So now I'm going to make my own barriers. What am I going to use? Barbed wire, grenades, mines. They had grenades in the Civil War. Everybody know that? You remember when Sherman was going from Atlanta to the coast? The Confederates started placing grenades, burying grenades on the march. We're going to call that a minefield. And when Sherman's men started having casualties, he called it barbaric. He had never seen such things. So he's going to make captured Confederates walk in front of his army to explode the grenades. But it slowed him up. So now I'm going to put minefields in front of my forces and use barbed wire. And I'll bring that marsh. I'll put that marsh anywhere I want using those tools that got their start in the Civil War. linear and frontal attacks, now that I'm going to keep you in front of me for a little while, and I got machine guns, that's going to cause an awful lot of damage in a hurry. And so linear attacks, frontal attacks are obsolete. I was looking at this show just last night on World War I, General Haig, British Field Marshal. 1916, one battle, 270,000 men dead. Dead, not wounded, dead. Because he liked frontal attacks. And after he did it again. Remember? Learn your lessons. So I'm not going to do frontal attacks anymore. What am I going to do? I'm going to use short rushes. But what's that mean? That means the captains and sergeants are important to whether or not I move forward. You know, every once in a while in the Civil War, a brigade commander might make a choice, a change, a doctrinal, a tactical change. Sometimes, every once in a while, regimental commander would do it, like Chamberlain. Or, who's the fellow over on Culp's Hill? Ireland, yeah, David Ireland. Here's the Spanish-American War. At the Battle of Las Guaymas, showed that the U.S., that quick-thinking American soldiers would not stick to the linear tactics which did not work effectively anymore. Spanish troops who had learned the art of cover and concealment from their own struggle with Cuban insurgents never made the error of revealing their positions while on the defense. Americans advanced by rushes and stayed in the weeds so that they were too invisible to the Spaniards, who used untargeted volley fire to mass fires against the advancing Americans. While some troops were hit, this technique was mostly a waste of bullets, as the Americans learned to duck as soon as they heard the word fuego, obviously means fire in Spanish. So now we're starting to trust our captains and sergeants, not our colonels, to make decisions on the battlefield. If you look at the Spanish-American War, the Battle of San Juan Hill, and read the accounts, it'll talk about A company doing this, or B company doing that, or Sergeant thus and so doing that. So we're not going to do the linear tactics. Okay? That's going to require some changes, though. This little cartridge is going to require changes in what? It's going to require changes in training. It's going to require changes in the officers. It's going to require changes in doctrine. Remember I showed you that earlier about one little item is going to make changes if you're smart enough to do it. Let's talk about cannons. You got a picture of a muzzle loader on the left and a breech loader, one of the Whitworths, over there on the right. So again, since about 950, when the Chinese developed cannons, they used them all muzzle loaders. So for a long time, up to 1854, we used muzzle loaders. Then we used breech loaders. What did it get us? Well, it could shoot 5 miles. Muzzle loader is 1 or 2, depending upon the rifling, right? Everybody with me? What are you going to do with 5 miles? Nothing. Makes a funny noise. That's it. Are we going to change? No. With a muzzle loader that shoots a mile, maybe 2, I start shooting when I have an enemy in front of me. I don't shoot before then, right? I got nothing to shoot at. Number of rounds at Pickett's charge, that's an estimate. Some people say 13,000. Oh, okay, average, fine. When I can shoot 5 miles or 6 miles or 10 miles, I move my cannons to the rear and take them off the line. And then what? They can shoot day and night. I got to be able to adjust fire so that they do damage. And be able to do that, I got to have somebody looking where it hits. Oh, move a little bit to the left. Shoot again. We're going to call that a forward observer. Okay? Then I got to have a way to communicate with the guy on the ground to move that cannon the right level. So we didn't do any cannon work after the Civil War except coastal artillery. What did it get us? Spanish-American War? No cannon. We had to borrow French cannon for World War I because we hadn't solved the problem yet. We'll come back to the history about it. But look at the number of rounds fired in one battle. 4.25 million. Because I get to fire all day, all night. Okay? We'll come back to that in a little while. Another one of them strings I'm going to leave it dangling for a while. Change of warfare. We talked a little bit about this, about the length, and now we're going to start stacking units in certain battles. There's an interesting report at the Battle of Chancellorsville, which if you're a student, you might want to consider reading, which is interesting. Jackson is now moving to the flank of the Union Army at Chancellorsville. Jackson's got 3 divisions underneath of him. One division is going to be behind another and behind another, so they're right behind each other. In the 2nd and 3rd divisions, the brigade commanders were told, if the brigade commander in front of you requests your support, don't go to your division, ask permission, go ahead. Now this is interesting. I've not done studying on this, but that's what I mean by stacking units. They're going to disrupt the entire chain of command for the Confederates. So why? To put more men on success as quickly as they can. I don't have time to go find my division commander, to go have time to go find General Jackson to ask permission. You brigade commanders are to go in immediately whenever asked for help. I've not ever seen that before. Has anybody seen that in the Civil War? I've not. And it was General Jackson that did it. Remember the spirit of the bayonet? So maybe old Jack could learn a few things. I don't know. And we talked a little bit about the balloon as an aerial platform. Right? That's another thing we're going to dangle for a while. We'll come back to. I got a lot of things to come back to. Here's the defenses around Richmond with the parallel trenches. We showed you this last year, or 2 years ago rather, at Sacred Trust. And a World War I trench line, no difference. Why? They didn't fight the American Civil War. They had not learned their lessons. And so the trench lines in Europe in World War I are going to be just like you see here. Give me a machine gun, boy, you can defend a long time in a trench line. Total war. The Civil War was not only long for us, 4 years, but the level of devastation and the duration was unparalleled in our history. But there was something else that's going to evolve, and that's that armies are not going to fight wars just among themselves, army against army. Now it's country against country, economics against economics, political against political. It's going to be a nation go to war, not an army. Okay? Think about some of the early battles in the Civil War. Yeah, you restock, You get new people, new equipment, you go fight your battle, and you go hibernate until you get fixed again. And when you get fixed, you come out and do it again. Right? That's what happened. Look at the Overland Campaign in '64, 5 battles in 40 days. Atlanta, 18 battles in 3 months. Vicksburg, 8 battles in 20 days. This is unheard of. Now you'll say, well, wait a second, General Lee did it in 1862. Had a battle of 7 days, got done that, went up and had 2nd Manassas, right? Got done that, and then went to Antietam. But the straggling was so bad at Antietam, he couldn't do it again. But now the Union Army is going to solve that. How? Because of their logistics system they have worked out. I can do battle after battle after battle, continuous. Read the Overland Campaign itself. Fight during the day, move at night. Fight again the next day, move at night. I don't know when they slept. Continuous fighting. Spanish-American War, 2.5 months. When you study it, I've forgotten. I knew we'd fought in the Philippines and Cuba, but I didn't know we did Guam and Puerto Rico too, all in 2.5 months. We mobilized 80,000 men for the Spanish-American War. How many did we mobilize in the Civil War? You know, both sides, maybe 5 million? I don't know. I got, 4 million? So now we have this continuous war. Once we get started, even during World War I, we got there, we had 22 divisions. They all didn't get it there at once. They had to go train. After they got trained, then they'd go fight for the British or the French or whoever. And then once all the Americans got trained up, now we're going to have our sector. Now we're going to do our attack. Once that started, 100 days. That's it, and then the war is over. Continuous fighting again. Okay? Unfortunately, in World War I, our guy worked for their guy, and their guy, like his British counterpart, liked frontal attacks. Pershing did not want to do what the British and French wanted him to do. He liked indirect approach. He wanted to do an indirect kind of thing. But it made the guy on the right nervous. So 26,000 casualties, 26,000 deaths for the Americans in those 100 days because of the guy on the right. What was missed? Well, we obviously missed artillery. We didn't do a darn thing. We missed the balloon and the impact that the balloon would have. We missed mobilization in the Civil War. And we also missed how to conquer trenches. Just missed them. Why? We'd won. Now I'm going to bring some things back together again. I didn't know this. 1861 in Fairfax City, Virginia, Union artillery fired indirect on Confederate supply areas. And a balloon was launched to adjust fire for the artillery. And flags were used, left or right, or elevate or depress. And so the cannoneers adjusted their fire without being able to see the enemy or where the rounds were landing based on the aerial platform in 1861 in Fairfax City. Sent a message from a balloon, too, to Abraham Lincoln from the lawn of the White House. Kind of interesting. Would have liked to have been Grant in a balloon like at Five Forks with a telegram. Well, missed mechanization altogether. They developed the internal combustion engine in 1872 and put it on, what's the first platform they used? Put it on balloons, dirigibles, you know, Zeppelins. So now we go across Atlantic. The first bombing raids in Paris and London in World War I were done by what? Balloons. They had planes, and when the planes started working, what did they use them for? Observation and intelligence, just like balloons. Okay? But it'll take a while. We used airplanes and trucks against Pancho Villa. Then it went. We lost it. No one was thinking. Here's an interesting one. 1862, a balloon landed on a barge in the middle of the Potomac River. I don't know why. I can't figure out why they even wanted to do it. But think about this. We have an aerial platform. We're going to land on a boat. And we did it in the Civil War. Now, they might have been at a local brewery before but I don't know. But it's interesting that we would even attempt this. Why don't you go out and see if you can land on a moving boat? Well, no, I believe we can do that. Anyway, so now you see the timelines for airplanes taking off from ships. We learned to take off ships in 1910, and we learned to land in 14. I don't know what we did in the extra 4 years. I don't know how successful we were when we did it the first time. But there's your first aircraft carrier right there in the Civil War. We talked a little bit about mobilization. There's a Secretary of War in 1889. Now think about this in our history. We mobilized 5 million people or 4 million people in the Civil War, and we learned nothing from it. We mobilized 80,000 in the Spanish-American War and realized we got to fix this mess. And Secretary Root would be instrumental, very innovative. He'll start a series of cannon or artillery conferences. By 1907, they will decide on what cannons to make and what capabilities they're to have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They can't make them in time for World War I. But at least we've started the process. Root's going to come in and start talking about training captains and NCOs because they have the responsibility, the small unit leaders, right? How many times have you heard an interview of a general saying, well, General, what's the secret to the American Army? What's his answer? Sergeants. Have you ever heard anybody say anything different? Sergeants. No other army in the world would say that. We're going to address the mobilization and the training problems. No more coal groves. Well, let's see if we can minimize it a little bit. So we're going to start the National Guard. That'll solve two problems, hopefully. Get some training to some folks so that when they do get mobilized, they will have some experience in higher level leadership, okay? And the units will have some level of success. Now for a long time, the National Guard was a sister, if you will, to their Army units. But now they're almost interchangeable. So we didn't learn the lesson on mobilization. Now we're going to put a couple of these ideas together. This is where you get into that. You remember at the beginning I said that guy's crazy? Well, let's see now. Ooh, how about that? And a little bit of that, and a little bit of that. Okay? Pershing notes in his reports about our weakness as an army. which we've already identified during the course of this talk, haven't we? Because we didn't learn anything from it. So let's see now. Okay, metal ships, air platforms. Aircraft carrier. Just putting a couple ideas together. I got to get across that trench line. I got to get through that barbed wire. I got to have it in a vehicle that bullets bounce off of. What am I going to come up with? The tank. You remember that for every action there's a reaction? What am I going to develop when I see this thing on the battlefield? The bazooka or some equivalent. Right? Every action, reaction. Okay. What was missed? Altogether. Let me see. How is Grant portrayed in history? Slow? Does he ever talk about what Napoleon did? What did he read at West Point? Romance novels. Was he a member of the Napoleon's Club up there? No. What's his interest? We don't know. He just kind of sits and squats and goes, whip 'em tomorrow. Right? At Pittsburgh Landing. Long after the war, when Grant traveled around the world, John Russell Young, who accompanied him, tells us that one day, quote, walking up and down the deck, Grant went on to describe all of Napoleon's campaigns from Marento down to Leipzig, speaking of each battle in the most minute manner, the number of men engaged on either side, the range of their guns, the tactics used on both sides, why victory came and why defeat came, as thoroughly learned as a problem in mathematics. Then he went back to the battles of Frederick the Great, Lutheran, the campaigns of the 30 Years' War, back to the campaigns of Caesar, and always illuminating as he talked the progress and change in the art of war, and how machinery and projectiles and improvements in arms had made what would be a great victory for Napoleon almost impossible now. For it was only on this occasion on which I had heard Grant ever speak of the art of war at all. You remember the fellows that we read about who know all the rules? They follow all the rules. Napoleon would do this now. Frederick would do this. Remember that? I read you that quote. I call those people mechanics. They can fix the car. You give them a manual and they can fix it. They're good at what they do. They can't design the car. They are not an architect. Here is a man that may be an architect. He knows the rules. He's not tied to them. He's described as unconcerned with casualties, a drunk. I don't know why. I think he deserves a little bit more attention. And his work at Five Forks is something else. Whew. Okay. I'll let you read that. Everybody with me? Everybody done so far? I hope over the last hour and 10 minutes, we have attempted to show the difference between a historian and a military historian, using the battle of the War of the Civil War as a platform for you to consider what you're reading and how significant it was and how relevant the Civil War is in our history. That it really is a waypoint. Without that Civil War, where would we have been? Where would we be today? What are your questions?
So where did you get the grant quote?
Pardon?
Where did you get the grant quote?
Oh. Grant and Lee, Fuller. Okay. Oh, good question. People always ask me, if you want me to send you my slides, I've included a slide with the bibliography. Okay. I had to read an awful, this is most of it, not all of them, but I had to read an awful lot of books because while there are a lot of them here and I didn't want to carry all the other books, you know, I was just trying to show you the level of intelligence that Grant had. And so this, I hope that quote did it. What other questions do you have? Nothing. Go Steelers. We'll see you next week.